things that you don't really care about, I thought I'd start with what I think is going to be the impact regime that applies in Australia. And just between you and me, the basis for this is having talked to Professor Byrne, who's the head of the ARC, and him having told me what he was planning to do. So maybe his plans will change. But let's start with what Australia is going to do. On the whole, I think the regime that he has in mind will be a good one and will probably work better than the British regime, which in itself took a lot of twists and turns, but in the end turned out to be not as bad as most people feared it would be. So really, if you think about the UK case, the central change was that it started out in a very crass, very crude, very economistic way, started out very obsessed with causation, and for various reasons that I'll illuminate here, I hope, actually you can't really use a very causal concept of impact in any productive way. So also there progressively came to be a cleavage between what we might call core impact and public engagement, and both of these tended to end up much more important, much more balanced in importance than originally. And finally, just one other thing, we believe and I say we because my co-authors here are sort of Simon Bastow, who used to work with me, and Jane Tinkler, who's still working with me on a book we're bringing out with Palgrave on maximising impacts. Well, what we believe is that really impact needs to be applied at a pretty high level. So it can't be applied to individuals or to individual departments even. It needs to be applied to quite big units and over quite long periods of time. And then finally just end up with a few suggestions of things that come from the book that universities who want to maximise their impact might think about doing. Whether anybody does anything in any particular setting, of course, depends a lot on where you are and what you're trying to do. So I hope these points will be useful. My lecturing approach is to bounce a lot of slides at you, and some people like this, some people don't. If you see too much text on the screen, I'll be trying to give you a fairly simple version of it when I talk. Okay, so what will the Australia impact assessment be like? We don't know. We've had various suggestions, and this is just my attempt at a forecast. The first thing to say is that the existing separation between the ERA and HERDIC kind of reporting, the separation of ranking and funding apparently is not going to change, and I think that's a better system than we've had in the UK, where funding and ranking decisions have been all wrapped up together. And that leads to universities over-investing in a huge amount of games playing to try and rig rankings in order to get more funds. So I think the Australian current system is better than that. How will the Australian Research Council assess impacts? I think there are going to be three key ways. The first will be external funding, which is beloved of the STEM sciences and the physical sciences and tech departments, who get most of the corporate funding. But external funding will also include government funding and public service funding and health service and other kind of funding. And that will apparently be assessed mainly through documentation and statistics. So you would need to have ways of making returns which might be specified in some extensive way by ARC and would need to be auditable and checkable. So that would be the first component. The second component would be a report on public engagement. Again, there would be sort of basic metrics, like we had this many events, and then it might be even better if you could say how many people came to the events, and then it might be even better if you could say that the people who came to the events liked the events, and then it might be better again if you could say that the people who came to the events and liked them were important people from different things. So, you know, it's up to you, but it's not going to be massively prescriptive. But you'd need to kind of think about recording stuff that you might not otherwise record. Particularly it's going to be important to do blogs and social media. Science communication, I know, is very well developed already in Australia, and I think, you know, there are very high standards here. But there's a few other little things that you might want to do. But blogs and social media, in my view, are the fundamental things that most Australian universities are not now doing and really should get it into their heads and just get on with it. And then the third thing will be a small number of impact case studies per department. In the UK, it's very prescriptive. You have to do an impact case study for every 6 academics. And even if you're a small department, you have to do 2 impact cases and so on. That produced a lot of very notorious games playing where departments adjusted the number of staff they put in order to restrict the number of impact cases they had to provide. And I think the ARC is not going to do that very prescriptive thing. Instead, what they're going to do is create a mixed committee of practitioners and academics and ask universities to submit a couple of cases per department, maybe a few more if it was a big department, but there didn't seem to be a huge appetite for a kind of rigidly enforced number of cases. And what would be in the case? Sort of up to you. Depends on your discipline, depends on your department, depends on what you're trying to do, depends on who you are, and so on, but they would be marked by these committees or assessed by these committees in some way. The overall thing designed to be a low burden thing, but of course bureaucrats always say it's low burden. What they mean by low burden is probably not what you or I might mean by low burden. And that's basically the regime that seems to be in progress. Let me just pause and see if anybody wants to say that I've got that completely wrong at this point, because I may well have done, but yes.
No, I think it sounds right. But I was wondering if you had a sense of the weighting of these things at all. And I guess the other comment would be the ARC, and it's a related comment, the ARC in its kind of evaluative exercises typically requires you to submit a lot of information. And certainly some of the first 2 of those things, A and B, are things that it routinely would collect from universities anyway. In the second case, for centres, you know, you have to, if you have ARC centre funding, you have to provide that information. But what I was going to say is in the Excellence in Research for Australia, so the research quality evaluation, although you have to submit a lot of information, only a very small part of it actually counts in terms of determining the evaluation. That seems to be the way that the ARC works.
The top 30%.
Well, no. So a university would make a submission in a unit of evaluation, a disciplinary area, which would be comprehensive around numbers of staff, full-time equivalent staff in the area, the number of outputs in an area, the amount of research income, a whole set of esteem measures, a bunch of sort of engagement measures. But the only thing that would actually count if you're in a citation-based discipline would be the citation-based metrics, and if you're in peer review, it would essentially be the peer review plus perhaps the category 1, the competitive grant income.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering if you have a sense from Addenburn about whether some of this would be more important than others. And the sector, the university sector is divided. Different bits of the sector are divided about the extent to which they want A versus C, for instance, and the disciplines are clearly to.
As far as I could tell, the idea would be that it would be discipline group related. So that if you were in STEM science and tech, you probably might see more of a weighting on external funding inflows. If you're in humanities, external funding inflows wouldn't really be a very important criteria. So it seemed as if it would be a relatively flexible or adjusted, so long as there's an overall conception of impact. And in fact, that's what's happened in the British REF. Basically, you know, things like public engagement are much more important in the humanities. Things like actual sort of core changes for firms or governments or public service delivery, more important in the social sciences. Things like new products and outputs in the society. Yeah.
Patrick, one of the things I was interested in there is we talked about at the beginning the problem of chasing causation. And the question about impact rates to the question of how do we, what is the impact of and how it relates to research.
Yeah.
And for example, you can have research that's conducted 20 years ago that's having an impact now.
Yes.
Is when you're talking about telling stories, to what extent are the telling stories related to specific research, and what are the frameworks of time for research? Because for the ERA we have frameworks, clear frameworks for research funding and publications, but impact can have a much longer durée. How do we tell the story about impact in terms of the time frame?
Okay, well, I think that's certainly clear that ARC is going to copy the REF here, because the REF took a very long time frame conception. So the basic conception for the 2014 REF was you had to have done it by about the early 1990s. I can't remember how long it was. Michelle, you might remember. It was 15 years or something.
Yeah, the time from the research was 15 years.
15 years, yeah.
The impact of the 15 years, but it's something about research within 5 years as well. So there was like
Well, the REF had a stupid model in which they assumed that you did the basic research and then you did the applied research and then you got it into the corporate or governmental world and then it was sort of implemented. Whereas actually, in many, many cases, you can see in the REF impact cases, of which there are 7,200, many of them, the timing was the other way round. You know, you started with the applied work and then you derived the pure work out of the applied work. So there's a whole lot of stuff. But the original timing was 15 years. What happened is that a lot of unis didn't really use the early part of the time period, because to go back 15 years might have looked a bit desperate. So on the whole, it was pretty well the last 10 years, de facto. But the rules allowed it, but no, people didn't use the early period.
I think 50%, the median of time to impact was 5 years, so 50% showing impact within 5 years and 50% within 5 years.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I certainly had a case which was in the 15-year thing, and my uni wouldn't put it in because it was a great case, but it was a bit old. Yeah.
Audience reach. I'm interested in how you measure an audience and whether you privilege some audiences against others.
Okay.
Is it more important to be read in New York than it is just down the road?
Well, that's interesting. The REF criteria, when they were originally announced, said we're going to assess research impact in terms of reach, how many people are affected, and significance, how much they were affected. Actually, relatively few impact cases have details on reach in them. There's quite a lot of stuff on significance, but we'll see in a minute that a lot of it is pretty qualitatively assessed. But all I'm saying is for public engagement activities, right, most unis will say, well, we did this many public lectures. They won't collect the audience data. They won't know who the audience is. They won't have asked the audience to evaluate the event, and so on. If you could do those extra things, then you're beginning to do a lot better. You can do that with surveys, or you could do it with event-by-event things. Similarly, if you're using social media and blogging, you get automatic reach, and then later on you get altmetrics data, how many people have read it, how many people have read to the end, how many people, having read it, tweeted it, or put it on Facebook, or liked it, or something like that. And then eventually you'll get citations. So, you know, the whole thing would be to show that your engagement was well targeted and was meeting the needs of, particularly, let's say, the Queensland audience, you know, because people are not going to come from Adelaide to Brisbane however good the talk, you know, but they might well come from all over the world and read a Queensland blog or a Brisbane blog.
In the UK, have people been trying to gamify those measures a bit? Because some of them would be quite easy to manipulate.
Right. Well, let me go on to the UK experience now, because I think that's where the questions are sort of heading. And you know, the first thing to say is that the UK started off with an impossible dream of what impact was going to mean. The impact was going to be very causal, it was going to be very crunchable, very economic. It was going to really keep the Treasury off your back and produce lots of new funding and all that sort of stuff. So the early definitions were like that. But before we get to that, sorry, we've got this whole overall giant bureaudemic apparatus where 52,000 academics are asked to send 4 pieces of work in. We've got a giant warehouse in Bristol with forklift trucks carting parcels of books and things around and delivering them to 50 different committees. An absurd 19th century way of doing the assessment, in my view, but anyway. And then for cases, we have a pile of cases, 7,200 cases, all in a rather rigidly prescribed format. One case roughly for every 7 or so people. And that gets 20% of the funding and actually has quite a big impact on the marks in this time round. Essentially what it does is the old research excellence assessment exercise privileged just pure research. So you got most of your funding just for producing pure research in an obscure journal using a lot of maths that nobody has read, and the assessors weren't quite sure whether it was any good because they weren't expert enough to assess it. That was the kind of old model. The new model was aiming to kind of rebalance the whole thing to get more of an emphasis on applied work, and that's really where the impact component comes in. And the only thing in the UK system that works is to have the funding follow the assessment, so 20% of the funding goes to impact. Originally, the definitions of what impact was were very economistic. This was an early definition that a lot of people thought was very threatening, especially if you're in the social sciences and humanities, or you're in bits of science that were not immediately sort of close to markets. So that kind of definition didn't last long. The research councils produced a longer, more complicated version which has got global economic performance and UK economic competitiveness, good old techno-nationalist themes, which are still very strong in the Australian innovation program, I see. But it also has increasing public services and quality of life. By the time you get to HEFGE's the agency that did the thing in 2014, they defined impact as an effect on change of or benefit to the economy, society, culture, public services, public policy or services, health, the environment, or quality of life beyond academia. So you can see it gets broader and broader and broader and broader. And just in case you don't think that's broad enough, this is the humanities panel expanding on what that means. So it means civil society, cultural life, economic prosperity, but also policy making, public discourse, and public services. So I'll leave you to pick through the things, but if you can find anything that's been left out, basically send me an email. And yet, still, what remains very strong in this whole mixture of a bureaucratic and an academic exercise is some kind of framework like this. So we have academic work over on the left-hand side, and then we have the academic impacts. So we begin to look at citations and university outputs, and then we try and think about outcomes, and then we evaluate the outcome change, and then we have external impacts. Now, in some sense, that contributes to economic or public policy outputs. Those are the things originally emphasized. That then has some kind of change for society, and then we make some evaluation of it. Now, the reason why that didn't work is because a lot of academic work doesn't really feed directly into policy or economic thing. It adds to what my colleagues and I call a dynamic knowledge inventory. Why do we call it that? Because the first time we presented it to some business people, someone from Yorkshire said, well, you say you're adding to the knowledge inventory, but inventory is bad. Inventory is unsold goods in the warehouse. And we don't want to add to that. So we thought, oh, we must improve this concept somehow with it dynamic. But basically, the dynamic knowledge inventory is that sort of proportion of all the stuff that we know we're using, if you see what I mean. And sometimes we're using something, and let's think about knowledge of the Islamic Caliphate in the 16th century. Sometimes we're using that in a very limited way because it has very limited relevance. And then somebody comes along and says, I'm going to re-establish the Islamic Caliphate, and it's going to run just like the 16th century. And that knowledge turns out to be incredibly much more important than we thought it was. So we've revalued it, we've changed it, and so on. And that happens all the time. So that's one big thing. We have a very dynamic knowledge inventory. And the mark of an advanced industrial society, in our view, is that it has a huge capacity to run on current knowledge and to expand that knowledge, and if it doesn't know what the solution is, to find a solution quickly. And then the other big reason why you can't easily evaluate is because of outputs. Multiple influences, multiple other factors acting on outputs and outcomes. So basically I think that the REF process in Britain ended up very, very broad and very, very inclusive, and ultimately satisfying everyone to more or less the same degree, because you cannot trace causal impact very far, and that is an inherent factor which is not going to go away and is not susceptible to even techno and digital change, which in other respects has lots of big implications. So that was the first thing to think about. The second thing to think about is impacts and engagement. You basically, the two lessons here are don't try and implement this in small units, come to that later, or small units of analysis, and don't try and have a causal definition. Try and have some kind of operational definition of impact. So let's just run through that. Why is that the case? Well, researchers seek involvement in impact work for very many reasons. I'll come on to some of those. Academic and civil society and governmental contexts, economic, governmental and civil society contexts are inherently multi-causal and very contested. So all academic impact is inevitably mediated. That's to say, other people are involved in the transmission or the development of the impact. We don't know what we mean by impact anyway. I'll just run by you three possible meanings of impact, and then prove to you that you can't even show that this is true of presidents or prime ministers or people right at the top of government, let alone researchers, sitting miles out trying to influence firms or governments. And finally, impact depends a lot on luck. Let's be frank, you can have great research that gets nowhere for exogenous reasons that have got nothing to do with the quality of the research. So let's just run through those. This is a list from a recent British government report, I'm sorry it's such small print and such fuzzy image, of reasons why people in universities say that they are working with firms and in the sci-tech kind of areas. And even here you've got a huge range and variety of things that people are trying to do. Some people are looking for funding, some people are looking for experience, some people are looking for more challenging issues, joined up issues and problems. Some people are looking for facilities they can't get, and other people are looking to work in a different organisation environment. The thing that a lot of scientists now find is that you can only do transdisciplinary work with, the right kinds of companies. So you can't do work on joined up issues in highly siloed university contexts. So there's lots of possible reasons why people are doing external work, and very few of these tend to be included in most impact assessment things. If we look at the actual evidence being cited in the UK cases, you can see that the percentage of evidence source that is testimonials is very, very high. It's close to 50% in most of the cases. Then we've got some that cite reports, which are not formal academic qualifications. They're privately published or they're not published at all. Then we have articles, and outside the life sciences, they're really quite small as a component of impact cases. I think this is a complete contrast to what the hefty people were expecting. They're expecting to see lots of academic work being the key sources of evidence. They were expecting to see the academic work come first, then the applied work, then the application, then the implementation. All of those timelines and expectations were not borne out. So you can see that really impact work is work that's done, within a very specified context, so that the reporting of it has to be very specific to that context. So how does academic work work? Well, somehow we have this transition. On the right-hand side, we have the targets we're trying to hit, the economy, the media or government, public policy systems. On the left-hand side, we have academic discipline, a typical academic discipline. If we use the Boyer four-way distinction, says, well, there's discovery work, which is, the eureka moment, always very prestigious but very elusive. Then we have integrative work, which is re-theorization, putting things together, showing things how previously anomalous empirical findings can be fitted into your overall framework. Then we have applied work. Those are the three big ones. And then we have teaching renewal. Well, how does transfer of ideas and impact occur between the left-hand side and the right-hand side? Well, one big flow is the physical movement of graduates into jobs. Now, whenever you do a research assessment exercise, you ignore that because that doesn't count as research. But actually, that's one of the most important ways in which impact occurs. Somebody gets trained on some new piece of equipment, and then they go into a firm and they use the new piece of equipment to solve some problem. So, it may not be rocket science, but training and physical transfer of bodies from academia to the economy is a very important part of research impact. But we'll leave it out for the moment. So then the question is, well, how does this impact interface work? Well, this is a single discipline kind of model. If we add in broader interdisciplinary influences, we've got three other very important multidisciplinary ways in which impact occurs. Bridging is when some big intellectual comes up with an idea like nudge or something like that, which then gets picked up in healthcare and education and public policy and all kinds of different things, and people use it in lots of different contexts and so forth. It's a meme. It's not really research. Public intellectuals don't do research. They do kind of crystallizing, kind of precipitative types of things like that. Then we have university local integration. You're really lucky to be in a really big, full spectrum university. I'm not. I'm in a tiny little social science specialist university where we're cut off from lots of very important local integration influences. And then academic service. So those are three big ways in which further integration occurs. And then the actual stuff is everything gets mediated. It gets mediated by consultants, professions, businesses, think tanks, media, specialist media, NGOs, you name it, it's out there. There's 101 different mediators, all of whom in different ways are better, quicker, faster, and more specialized than universities. So proving that something actually started with you and then went directly into government or into a business is just really, really difficult. And it's always going to be incredibly difficult unless universities, start their own broadcasters, start their own think tanks, start their own consultancies. Well, universities have done all of these things, right? And perhaps should do more, perhaps will do more. But the current mediation setting is a real problem for tracing impacts. What does impact anyway mean? Let me introduce you to 3 concepts of impact, which comes out of the literature on leadership, actually. Well, my literature on leadership. So we're trying to assess the influence of President Obama on US foreign policy. How might we decide that President Obama has or hasn't had influence? Well, the first thing we might say is, what did President Obama want to do? How were they trying to, where was their bliss point, and how successfully did they move American foreign policy towards their bliss point? Well, not too well, really, probably, is the answer in this particular case. So he wanted to move to a more cooperative world, but the world exogenously got a lot less cooperative during his term in office. Okay, so then we get to the second criterion, which is a counterfactual criteria. And that says, well, did President Obama manage to do things that, were better than would have happened if it had been, let's say, George Bush there? Well, we might say yes. That's a thing that we can say. He may not have got what he wanted, but he perhaps did better than what might have happened with somebody else. But assessing any kind of counterfactual is really, really difficult. And then the final criterion is, well, can we say that, President Obama fixed the policy? So he got the policy into exactly that thing. He was the last voice that sort of tied it down to a particular setting. And those are the 3 criteria that people have been trying to apply to academic research in relation to economic change and in relation to government. And those are really absurdly demanding criteria. You can't show that President Obama meets all 3 of these. You can't show that any leader, in my view, meets all 3 of these. But if the person at the very top of government can't be shown to meet these, it's ridiculous to begin to try and apply them to researchers. And you have combinations of the things. If you can make a case under a couple of headings, that's a bit better than if you can only make it under 1. But you've got to stop applying unrealistic, criteria of prove to me that this really influenced that kind of stuff. It's just never going to work. What does that mean you have to do? Well, you have to have an operational definition of research. This is our definition. So an impact is an observable, recordable, or otherwise auditable occasion of influence from academic work, from academic research on another actor or organization. So if the influence is academic, it's a citation, it's a reading, somebody in another uni downloaded your stuff and read it, someone with a journal subscription read it, somebody liked it on an academic blog, that's an academic impact. If it's an impact on an external organization, it's got to be something outside the higher education sector. But it's got to be a recordable or otherwise auditable occasion of influence. And in my view, in our team's view, anything more than that is just telling fairy stories of influence. Because we just can't actually focus on those. So anything in yellow here, you can get some reasonable data on, you can feasibly assess it. Anything in blue, it's not actually feasible to assess it. anything in pink, it's not an assessment anyway. You can call it a peer review if you want, but it's just some bureaucratic, academic, mixed evaluation. So, what you can tell is we did this research, we, blogged it, we got this much social media, so many people read it. Let me give you an example. One of my colleagues wrote an article published in a journal called Public Administration about a survey asking if academics, if British government leaned on them to produce evidence that was congenial to policy rather than, producing evidence and then the government making evidence-based policy. This has had 120 reads, 150 reads maybe in this journal over the last 2 years, and it's had 42,000 reads on our LSE blog. So it's a different kind of order of magnitude and a different audience, of type of audience that's read this. So on the blog there's no literature review, there's no methodology, there's no long discussion of alternative interpretations, there's just a basic, here's the core findings of the research. So I think you can show that these are recorded occasions of influence. You can't show that even in that case that there was influence, just as, if somebody reads an article in a paper, they've read it, they might agree with it, they might think it was rubbish. You don't know any more than we do here. You can then sometimes show gross causal effects. You can sometimes trace through, process trace impacts to the extent of an immediate gross causal effect. What you can't ever really do is show the counterfactual or even assess any net causal effect. You can show some general process benefits. Sometimes you can show specific process benefits. We invented this way of doing public consultations. We can see that this way of doing public consultations has been effective. The case I wanted to get my university to send in was that I invented a system for electing the London mayor, which has now been used in every mayoral election in London and is being used in 30 different mayoral elections across the country. It is now used to elect police commissioners. So I can show that 12 million people have used my voting system since 1990. I thought that was a good case. My colleagues thought, not good enough, Anyway. So you can sometimes show some sort of process benefits, but you can't really get into any kind of netting out of causal effects, and you can't really attribute outcomes to academic work. Sorry, I should just say you should also assess across big units. So the finer grain you go, the less feasible it is to assess things. So you might say a group of 50 researchers should have had some, should have struck it lucky a few times over the course of a decade. But what you can't say is that any individual academic should have struck it lucky over the course of a decade. And for example, in science and technology, let's say you're a British scientist or a British engineer, you very often will form a relationship with a local company 15 years ago, and you will perhaps do quite a lot of applied work with them, and then they get taken over by an American or Japanese or Chinese multinational, and they close down the line of work, and it all comes to naught for nothing to do with the quality of the research, but just to do with luck. And the impact of luck means you need to assess across bigger units and not littler units. So you can't assess individual academics' impact or grants. Well, there's a chapter in our book on impacts where we do think, can you do lifetime assessment for academics? I think you perhaps can, but it's quite like the book that Randall Collins did on sociology of philosophies, which basically says, when you're trying to establish who are the big philosophers and why some of them have lasted and why others, you turn to the last chapter of his book to see what the answer is, and he says, well, the first thing to do is to say the same thing a lot of times and keep saying it for as long as possible. So live long and repeat yourself. That's the first thing, and the second thing is to have lots of disciples. who repeat you and elaborate you and so forth. And the third thing is to get lucky and have royal patronage or some other kind of thing. So basically, you shouldn't try and assess impact across small units. You should only try and assess impact across big groupings of researchers. So all of STEM researchers in a university, all of social sciences, all of humanities. Some disciplines, you can do this at the national level. Some disciplines in Australia particularly might be too small, so you should perhaps think about the groupings there. Australian discipline statistics are weird, have weird categories in that are years out of date, and they're not very good. Try and use them to, construct a social science thing, and it's quite tricky. But you need to modernise the statistical base of the current that's currently used. And you can assess across all universities. I think that's perfectly feasible. Well, let me just give you a quick example of how you can do this big scale assessment. So this is what we did in our book on the impact of the social sciences in the UK. And we started with the research core, and then we looked at the number of research staff and the level of economic impact, which is what you see here. So 32,000 staff, costing about 850 million quid last year. Then we added in all the other academics who are perhaps not doing research. Well, actually most social scientists do research. 90% do teaching as well. And then we added in other economic spending in those departments. Then we added in the students. So we've got 625,000 social science students, and they plus the staff create induced a value of 4.8 billion. That's basically what the social science community in the UK is. It's like 650,000 people, 5 billion worth of economic activity. And then the question is, well, how much impact are they having outside? And our suggestion was, well, let's look at all the job descriptions, which are for social science related professional people, and where the people involved have master's or PhD level qualifications. And that ends up with another 410,000 people outside the social science sector who are being employed in jobs which look as if they are mainly mediating social science knowledge to their organisation, mainly in public policy, in the NHS, public services on the one hand, and in the financial services and banking on the other, and a little bit in consultancy. And then we took the average salary of these folks and we computed it out, and we come to a figure of about £25 billion is being spent on employing these mediating folks in governmental and private sector organisations. So we've got a discipline that's sort of around about a 5 billion discipline, and it's got a 29 billion audience altogether. And that, I think, is a good way of doing it. If you're assessing across big units, you can get a good idea of impact. And somewhat similar sorts of things you could do. Well, I've been waffling on too long, so I'm just going to get to my top 10 suggested things to do to maximise. And I'll skip across a few slides just to do this in 3 goes. The first thing is clean up academic branding. Multiple branding problems are a huge difficulty for business and for government and for outside people in dealing with universities. This is the branding map of the London School of Economics. It's a complete gargantuan mess. Somehow you have to get through this problem that academic branding and academic organisation, academic branding and academic creativity are very limited. But if you've got hundreds and dozens of brands, it's no wonder that British business, the 4th biggest problem they have is just finding anybody who's doing what they want to get done. Then you need to look at your events programs, so don't just publicise your external speakers, publicise your internal folk. work better in networks. Universities still have, in many cases, kind of absurd idea that they can do everything themselves, and they're not. That means that they don't do networking very well, and when they do networking, they give too much away. They're not hard-nosed networkers who really negotiate as they should with mediators. You need to become serious digital media players. I hope you've got an online repository in Queensland where you lodge absolutely everything that gets published in an open access online way. That is now a criterion for the REF 2020. If you get an article accepted in the UK and you wanted to count in 2020 for the research assessment, within 3 months of it being accepted, whether it's published or not, you have to have it in an open access online repository, and you have to have it available. So that's a really big trend now in Britain and in some of the biggest world foundations to push towards open access work. It's part of a whole change that's going on with replicability and other things. And the great thing about this is open access web materials are much more cited. So every academic should publish something as soon as they've published it as a paper in a journal. They should blog it in a good blog, and they should deposit it in at least 3 big kind of places: their own university online repository, ResearchGate, and academia.edu. If you're not doing that, you're not selling your work really now. And then you need to tweet it and intervene and point it out to people, and basically don't rely on the journal to do anything. And then, think about academic blogs. If you haven't got those, these are very important. We started our first one in LSE in March 2010, in the run-up to the general election. And we were just doing a count this last month. And the LSE website has millions of accesses a year. I won't say exactly how many, but, we have 8 million accesses just for our podcasts alone. And 1 in every 9 of our accesses now are accesses to academic blogs. So that's just shot up from nothing in March 2010 to 1 in 9. And that's just the beginning, I think. And of course, every blog has to have social media, Twitter, Facebook, and other things along with it. And then just the last 3 suggestions. Nothing is so easily forgotten or become blurry as your own occasions of influence. So, and if you're dealing with stuff on you could do impact work or you couldn't do it, depending on how you feel like, which is more or less what Tim said in his introduction, if I'm paraphrasing, the answer is that a lot of people won't do it. I think you should just go out there and say, if you've got a staff appraisal form, let's have a section on impacts. Traditionally, you did teaching, research, administration, good citizenship. Now you do teaching, research, impact, administration, good citizenship. So I don't think it's that much to ask, and it's probably a good idea for people to be asked, because unless you're asked, people know you're not serious. Think about your customer relationship information. Most universities acquire information, then lose it again, then acquire it again, lose it again, acquire it again, lose it again, all over the place. Every department is doing it. It's a very difficult political organizational problem to sort out who should do it, and who should do it changes from institution to institution and time period to time period, but it's going to be incredibly important. We're living in a big data age. Universities have lots of big data that they acquire and then goes missing again. So what you need is a customer relationship management system. You probably need to think about your case studies, since you're going to have to do a couple of case studies per department. Our experience in the UK is you probably need to have a few practice runs and then have a few evaluations and so forth. I don't think it's going to be as onerous as our ludicrously overdeveloped process was. But even so, I think it's a good thing to try and do a few cases. And then finally, try and, don't just acquire information about your impact, but then try and process that information to how you deal with people, how you deal with students, how you deal with local business, how you deal with local public services, local state and local government, or other units of government, other countries' governments, how you deal with NGOs. So those would be the 10 suggestions, and I had a lot more slides, but I'm going to stop here because it's probably not feasible. Thanks.
Thank you, Patrick. That was terrific. There was lots there in your. There was a lot there in your 10 lessons, including some advice for us, which I'm sure people want to pick up on. But there was already a bit of an interaction early on in terms of what the content of the ERA system in Australia is likely to be. But there's plenty there about